So you just kind of described in the arrangements when you're kind of working up towards the deal about how critical the alignment is between the goals, the intention, and you talked a lot about kind of almost the culture of the organizations and how well they match. You talked about kind of steady Eddie versus high growth, and to me, when you describe that, it kind of speaks to the culture of the organization. Because I found that when you do build a high growth team, when you build a culture of kind of let's get to that next milestone, let's keep everything rolling, let's build momentum, can be quite different from you described steady Eddie. So can you kind of talk a little more about the culture and the things you look for in culture and what kind of significance it has?
Every company has a culture, whether the management team is intentional about creating that culture, that may not always exist. And if they are, if the management team is intentional about creating a culture, then they have a good chance of the culture ending up the way that they want it to. And it won't always get there. But if it's management's intent to create a culture of really long working hours, but the company being your family and people there till midnight, they can do that, and they lead by example, and then that kind of happens. Right. If the management wants to create a culture of very family-based, regular hours, super flexible, they can do that, and they can think about that. If they want to create a culture of fun, they can do that. But sometimes we've seen in some companies where the management teams aren't intentional about the culture. They just they show up to work. They got their jobs. They each have their roles. They do those, and then the culture just kind of happens. And it sometimes there's a few loud people in the company, and they start leading some things, and all of a sudden that's your culture, and it just sort of shows up, and it's just created. So I think before we even get to what a buyer looks for, I just think it's important generally for management teams and owners to be intentional about their culture. Whatever it is that you want as an owner, and I think most cultures can be good cultures, as long as you're not creating a really toxic culture, whether it's a super hardworking, late hours culture, much more family balance, a little bit more fun, a little bit more serious and corporate. All of those are okay cultures, and it's the management and owner's job to create those. I think it's their job to create them intentionally. And so now you've got a culture. Whether you wanted it to be there or not, you have one, and your company is known by your culture. Right. So how does that fit with a buyer? And in my opinion, if you're being acquired by a strategic buyer, so where you're going to be absorbed into that company and become a part of that company, right, then I think cultural fit is important. Then it has to be aligned. If you're a company where the owner has young kids and has in turn really put that throughout the organization, saying that we are ultra flexible on things. Friday afternoons, get out of here. If it's a nice day, go out there. I know you'll get the work done. Like we're here. We're a big family. We need to get our work done. But like if you're not here 40 hours, that's okay. And if you're acquired by a company that expects its employees to routinely work 70, 80 hours a week, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
And there's a good chance you will lose all of your people in that transaction, and all the value that the buyer paid for will just disintegrate into nothing, and all the people as the owner that you cared about will lose their jobs, and that wouldn't be a great thing, I don't think. So if you're being acquired by a strategic and the companies are blending together, I really think it's important that you spend time understanding the buyers and the sellers' culture and make sure that they're at least somewhat aligned so that there's not these major problems that happen later on.
A lot of the business owners that I talk to, we talk about culture, they seem to get nervous. They kind of go, well, culture is one of those airy-fairy, feely, touchy things. They have a hard time defining almost. Yeah. It's somewhat nebulous.
And it is, but that's absolutely nebulous.
Well, I think to me, it's how we describe it.
Yeah.
Because I reframe it for them, and quite often it's transformational. I say, and this isn't my words, this is from somebody way smarter than me, culture is simply the behaviors you tolerate. That's your culture. So I don't care what words you've got on the wall. I don't care what you say your core values are, and all of that mission statements and all other stuff. Culture at the end of the day is the behaviors you tolerate. And when you think of it that way, then I think that makes it, to me, easier for us to be intentional on our culture.
Yeah.
Because it's interesting, because when you describe the cultures, you describe really patterns of behavior. End of the week, I get all my work done, but I'm not in the office 12 hours a day. I might be working 2 o'clock in the morning at home after my kids are in bed, but I'm getting stuff done, those kind of things. So I think there's, I think there's how you look at it and how you help them kind of think about being intentional on that culture, I think is so critical. What are some other things that you think they can proactively do? So the culture piece is one. What about things like, a lot of business owners, so much of the business is in their heads. So much of their patterns or behaviors are just habitual. From that perspective, what do you think kind of some of the other areas like processes and systems and other things like that kind of get it out and beyond the owner? What do you advise around some of those types of things?
I think processes are very important. But let's first talk about just the owner having everything in their head. And if the owner has everything in their head, then they can't leave the business, at least not anytime soon.
Yep.
And that usually becomes fairly obvious in the due diligence process, how much the owner has just in their head.
Right.
And that can be a problem. If the owner has the intention on leaving, that could be a deal breaker. And that brings us back to making sure that there's that good second in command.
Yeah.
And and if the owner has everything in their head, but the second in command also has it all in their head, and then they've got some good people around them, maybe it's okay. But absolutely, documenting some things definitely helps. But some things you can't really document. You can't document relationships or how I sell this thing, or you can't document a lot of those things. You can't document how the owner creates a culture in the office. So those are I guess you could, but they'd be very difficult and almost pointless, I think, to document. So I think the processes for the operations side of the business, absolutely critical. But for the softer side of the business, the sales, the culture, that is the behaviors you tolerate, and you have to be comfortable with those in the business that you're buying.